The sun had begun its slow descent behind the rolling hills, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers, and the distant lowing of cattle blended with the soft rustle of the wind. She stood by the edge of the wooden fence, her fingers tracing the rough grain as if trying to anchor herself in the moment. The day had been long, the kind that made the muscles ache and the heart crave something steady, something true. Yet, in the quiet hum of the evening, she felt the stirrings of a restless anticipation, a pull toward something she couldn't name. He appeared on the horizon like a figure from an old painting, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind him. His hat tipped low, obscuring the hard lines of a face that had seen 1,000 miles of dust and open skies. Yet the way he carried himself spoke of patience, of a kind of quiet strength that seemed both steady and inviting. The horse he rode moved with calm purpose, hoofs thudding in time with the rhythm of the prairie. As he drew closer, she felt a flutter she hadn't felt in years, a dangerous, thrilling tug at the edges of her heart. He dismounted slowly, the leather of his boots squeaking against the wooden fence post as he leaned lightly on it. There was a pause, a moment of hesitation, almost as if he weighed his words in the air before letting them slip. His eyes, shaded beneath the brim of his hat, held hers with a calm intensity. Every step he took seemed measured, yet effortless, like a man used to moving through the world quietly, leaving little trace but the impression of presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the wind with surprising clarity. "May I hold you?" The question, so simple, landed with a weight that made her chest tighten. There was no hurry in his words, no demand. Just a gentle inquiry that held within it something unspoken trust, longing, and an undeniable tenderness. She wanted to step back, to deny the stirring feeling it unleashed, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The evening air seemed to hold its breath along with her. For a long moment neither moved. She could feel the pulse in her neck, the way her heartbeat had gone from a soft hum to a rapid drum. Every instinct in her told her to retreat, yet every fiber of her being leaned toward him. The prairie around them seemed to blur, the golden light painting him in hues of warmth that made the world feel suspended, outside of time. His hand hovered just slightly in front of her, careful, patient, as if the act of touching her was sacred. There was a quiet honesty in him that was rare, a kind of raw sincerity that cut through the chaos she had carried with her. She glanced down, noticing the faint lines of dust on his worn jacket, the scuff on the heel of his boot, evidence of a life lived under the wide, open sky. It was a life she had only glimpsed from afar, hard, solitary, yet undeniably free. And there was something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world, that made the hair on her arms rise in sudden awareness. I don't know," she said softly, almost more to herself than to him. Her fingers tightened around the fence post as if holding on to something real could steady the swirl of emotions inside her. She could feel the pull of the moment, that precarious tension between fear and desire, hesitation and surrender. The prairie seemed endless, yet, in that instant, it was all contained in the space between them. He didn't step closer. He only nodded slightly, a small gesture that acknowledged her uncertainty without pressing it. His hand remained still, patient, and the quiet power of his presence seemed to whisper promises she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. There was a gentleness there that was unexpected, almost dangerous in its rarity. She had seen men in towns and trading posts, men with smiles that faded when the workday ended, men whose hands held roughness but not tenderness. This man held both. A hawk cried somewhere above, its sharp call slicing through the soft hum of the evening. She turned to watch it rise against the backdrop of the sunset, her chest still tight, her mind racing with questions she couldn't name. Why did a single question feel so intimate? So urgent? She had known loneliness, the kind that pressed against the bones, the kind that made her laugh and cry in solitude. Yet this man, this lone cowboy, made her heart remember what it felt like to hope. He shifted slightly, just enough for her to notice, and the faint scent of leather and sun-warmed earth reached her. It was grounding, solid, real in a way that made the fluttering in her chest even harder to deny. She wanted to reach out, to let go of caution and step into whatever promise his presence held, Yet the past whispered its warnings, memories of trust broken, of hearts left behind like worn-out boots in the dust. "Take your time," he said, voice still low, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into the chill settling over the prairie. It wasn't a command, it wasn't a plea. It was a gift, an offering of patience that somehow made her feel both safe and terribly exposed. She met his gaze again, and in the fading sunlight she saw not just a man, but a story, a life carved from hard days and long nights, a life that seemed to beckon her into its rhythm. The fence between them became more than a boundary. It was a fragile line of choice, a moment poised between what had been and what could be. Every heartbeat, every breath felt amplified. She realized that she wanted to know him, to understand the silent strength behind the quiet gaze, to unravel the stories hinted at in the curve of his shoulders and the way he lingered near her without imposing. And yet the unknown remained a shadow at the edges of her hope, a reminder that desire without certainty carried its own risk. The prairie itself seemed to lean in, the wind carrying whispers of old songs, of tales told around firelight, of lives intersecting in fleeting moments that could alter the course of everything. She sensed the weight of it all, the possibility, the hesitation, the ache of hearts too long restrained. And in that charged stillness she found herself wondering if this single moment, this gentle question, could tip the balance between solitude and something richer, something she had only dared imagine in stolen dreams. He waited, not with impatience, but with that rare stillness that made her realize he was as present in the moment as she was. She swallowed hard, feeling the tension twist inside her like the slow tightening of rope. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ground, painting the world in deepening oranges and purples. Time seemed to bend, slow, and yet rush all at once, carrying them both forward into a space where choices weighed heavily. And yet the pull of connection was undeniable. A single breeze lifted strands of her hair, brushing her face, and she closed her eyes for just a heartbeat. In that instant she felt the gravity of possibility, the weight of unspoken emotions, and the thrill of the unknown. She opened her eyes again, meeting his, and the world narrowed to that point of tension. That delicate space where decision and desire collided. "May I hold you?" he whispered again, softer this time, almost a caress. And in that simple, unhurried question, she felt an intimacy that startled her, a promise that threatened to unravel the careful walls she had built around her heart. She knew the answer could change everything, yet she hesitated, caught in the fragile web of anticipation, hope, and fear. Somewhere in the distance, the first stars began to pierce the evening sky, small points of light against the fading gold, mirroring the tiny sparks of courage and longing flickering between them. And as the wind carried the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, she realized that the moment was theirs to shape, but she didn't know how far she was willing to step into the unknown. The cowboy waited, steady, patient, a silhouette against the dying light, and she felt the magnetic pull of something she had almost forgotten existed, the gentle power of connection. The thrill of hearts brushing close and the delicate tension of a choice that could change everything. Her hands trembled slightly on the fence, her pulse a wild rhythm in the quiet evening. And though the answer hovered on the edge of her lips, she did not speak it. The moment held, suspended like the final note of a song that had yet to finish, and the prairie seemed to lean in, holding its breath with her. The prairie grew darker as the last streaks of sunlight faded, leaving behind a cool hush that settled over the land like a soft blanket. The fence post beneath her fingers was rough, grounding, and she realized that in all the years she had lived on the edge of this wide-open land, she had rarely felt a moment like this, suspended between fear and hope. She wanted to look away, to retreat into the comfort of her daily routines, but her gaze kept returning to him. The lone cowboy, his silhouette sharp against the twilight, carried a weight she couldn't yet name, and she sensed that his story was tangled with the kind of history that didn't let go easily. He shifted slightly, the leather of his jacket creaking faintly. There was something about the way he moved, controlled, deliberate, aware of every inch of the space around him that made her heart tighten. She had grown up in this region, learned to read the prairie like a map, and yet there was an air about him that she couldn't decipher. A stranger who seemed to belong at once and nowhere. His eyes, dark and steady, held fragments of the past, shadows that hinted at secrets, and she felt an inexplicable pull to uncover them. Her mind wandered back to the stories she had heard around the old general store, tales of men and women who had lived through dust storms, harsh winters, and cattle drives that tested the limits of patience and courage. They spoke of heartache and loyalty, of bonds forged in solitude and hardship. And somewhere deep in her memory, she realized that she had always imagined meeting someone like him, not the loud, brash types who filled the town with their noise, but someone quiet, measured, whose presence alone spoke of depth and resilience. Yet she knew better than to trust appearances. Loners carry burdens, often invisible to those who only saw their rugged exterior. She had learned that trust was something earned slowly, a lesson hard-won through years of watching promises dissolve like morning mist over the hills. And still, despite that caution, she felt herself leaning into the possibility, caught between instinct and longing. He finally stepped closer, just a pace, enough to close some of the distance, but not enough to erase the tension that crackled between them. His voice came again, soft, almost a murmur carried by the wind, and this time it held a touch of humor, like a secret shared just between the two of them. You know, this prairie holds more than just grass and cattle. It carries old stories, things people forget until they're forced to remember. She glanced at him, curiosity and wariness warring in her chest. Stories like what? She asked, though her voice was quieter than she intended. The twilight shadows deepened across his face, but there was a spark there, a hint of mischief or perhaps a warning, and she couldn't tell which. He leaned against the fence post next to her, just close enough for the warmth from his jacket to brush against her sleeve. "Things people don't always tell the newcomers," he said slowly. "Secrets of the land. Families who vanish, hidden cabins tucked away in the hills, old letters no one dares read. This place remembers everything, even when folks think it doesn't." She swallowed, feeling the hairs on her arms rise. The prairie had always been familiar, a place of comfort and work, of sunsets and starry nights. But in his presence it felt like a living entity, attentive, knowing, as if it had its own story to share, and he was the only one who could interpret it. She wanted to ask more, to probe, but the words stuck in her throat. Curiosity gnawed at her, sharp and insistent, yet the uncertainty of who he really was held her back. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, keeping her tone steady, though her pulse had quickened. The question was simple, but it carried with it an undercurrent of everything she hadn't dared to say, the caution, the unease, and the strange attraction that made her pulse quicken. He hesitated for a fraction of a moment, and she saw the faint shadow of something behind his eyes. A memory, a regret, perhaps even a secret that weighed heavier than the sun-baked leather he wore. "Here?" he echoed softly, almost like tasting the word. "I'm passing through, mostly. The prairie has a way of drawing people out, showing them things they might not see in town." He glanced at the horizon, the first stars starting to blink faintly in the indigo sky. "Sometimes it gives you answers, sometimes it just reminds you of the questions." She studied him closely, noting the way the corner of his mouth twitched in that subtle, almost imperceptible way that hinted at humor or pain. She had seen that look before on older men who had carried secrets for decades, and it made her pulse tighten. There was a depth to him, a life lived in shadows and open spaces alike, and she realized she had been standing on the edge of understanding someone who might never fully reveal himself. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant cabin. It reminded her of her own home, the small kitchen with its wooden floors, the iron stove that warmed more than just the room. Memories of her family, of quiet evenings and chores done side by side, filled her mind. She wondered if he had ever known that kind of home, or if the prairie had been all he had ever known. The thought made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "Did you always live out here?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation steady, to ground herself in normal questions, though her voice betrayed a hint of curiosity and concern. He looked back at her, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of the first stars. "Mostly," he said. "Born near the river, raised on horses and dust, taught to ride before I could run. The land teaches you things towns don't." There was a pause, and she could sense the weight in his words, the invisible burden carried silently for years. It teaches patience. It teaches quiet. And sometimes it teaches you to wait for what matters most. She felt her fingers tighten around the fence. There was a rhythm to his speech, a cadence that matched the slow thrum of her own heartbeat. He spoke of waiting as though it were both a punishment and a gift, and she wondered what he had been waiting for all these years. A companion? A chance? Or perhaps redemption from mistakes she couldn't yet understand? The prairie grew colder as night settled in, the soft hum of crickets filling the spaces between their words. Fireflies began to blink faintly, tiny sparks against the deepening darkness, and she felt the tension in her chest grow with every passing moment. The question he had asked earlier, "May I hold you?" hovered between them, unspoken yet alive, and now she realized it carried a weight far greater than a simple gesture. It was about trust, about patience, about opening herself to something unknown and possibly transformative. He didn't move closer, but his presence pressed against her in a way that made her keenly aware of every movement, every breath. She could see the muscles in his arms, the calluses from years of labor and riding, and there was an honesty in that physicality that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of the question he had asked. She wanted to step back, to shield herself from the pull of the moment, yet her feet felt rooted to the prairie soil. "Sometimes the land keeps its own counsel," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Sometimes it hides what's coming until you're ready to face it." He lifted his gaze to the stars now, the vast sky opening above them in a way that made her feel both small and infinite at once. And sometimes it gives you a choice. One chance to step forward or step back. Her chest tightened as she considered his words. Choice. It was a word she had rarely dared to claim for herself, often shaped and restrained by circumstance, by what was expected, by what was safe. Yet now, with him standing near, the possibility of stepping forward shimmered like the faint light of a distant star. She didn't know what that choice would bring, only that it held the potential to change everything. A distant owl hooted, echoing across the hills, and she felt the fragile thread of tension stretch tighter, fraying with possibility. She wanted to speak, to ask the questions crowding her mind, but the words refused to form. The stories he hinted at, the past he carried quietly in his gaze, and the pull of the prairie itself created a web of uncertainty she wasn't sure she could navigate. And yet, despite the unknown, despite the caution she had carried like armor all her life, she felt herself leaning just a fraction closer. Just enough to feel the warmth of his presence, just enough to sense the gravity of what might unfold if she allowed herself to. The wind carried the scent of earth and distant smoke, the world quiet except for the pulse between them, and she realized that the prairie itself seemed to be waiting with her, holding its breath in anticipation of what came next. The cowboy's gaze softened as he noticed the small shift, the hesitation laced with curiosity. He did not speak, did not move, only held the space with a patience that was at once gentle and commanding. And she understood, in a deep and unexpected way, that this moment, this fragile, quiet pause, was a turning point. A decision had yet to be made, a story yet to unfold, and the tension hung like a low-hanging cloud, pregnant with possibility. The stars above multiplied, tiny sparks that mirrored the flicker of courage and longing inside her. She still did not answer his question, still did not step forward or back. The night deepened, the prairie stretched endlessly around them, and the lone cowboy remained, a figure of mystery and quiet promise. The question remained suspended, fragile yet weighty, and she knew that what happened next could change everything, though the answer was still out of reach. The prairie night settled around them like a dark velvet cloak, the wind whispering softly through the grass, carrying scents of dry earth, wild sage, and the faint tongue of river water from miles away. She stayed by the fence, shoulders tense, listening to the rhythm of the world, aware of every distant animal cry and every subtle shift in the shadows. The question he had asked lingered in the air, heavy and fragile. "May I hold you?" It had opened something in her that she hadn't realized was locked tight, a mixture of longing, fear, and an ache for connection she had spent most of her life denying. But life on the prairie was never simple. She had learned early that beauty could be dangerous, that a calm evening could turn into a storm in minutes. And the cowboy standing near her with his steady presence and quiet intensity reminded her that some people carried storms inside them, hidden beneath the surface of calm. He was not just a man passing through. She sensed that he carried burdens, secrets that could complicate everything she thought she knew about safety, trust, and even her own heart. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of hooves on the far trail. She tensed instinctively, scanning the horizon where the shadowy shape of another rider appeared. The figure was moving with purpose, head lowered, posture tense, and she immediately recognized the feeling of unease it brought. The prairie, for all its openness, had a way of revealing dangers only if one paid attention. She glanced at the cowboy, and for the first time, she noticed a subtle tightening in his jaw, a shadow passing across his face. "Someone's coming," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying urgency. He nodded, eyes narrowing in the direction of the approaching figure. "Could be trouble," he said carefully. "Could be nothing, but you watch. Always watch." There was an edge to his tone, a reminder that life in these parts was lived cautiously, that people often wore intentions hidden beneath plain faces and weathered clothes. She understood immediately. The prairie had taught her to read such warnings, to feel the tension before it broke into action. But the presence of danger now added another layer to the evening, another reason for hesitation. The question he had asked, the unspoken pull between them, suddenly felt fragile against the real possibility of conflict. Her heart raced in a different way, one sharpened by instinct rather than longing. The rider drew closer, and she could see now that it was a man, rough-looking, wearing a coat too heavy for the season, hat pulled low. There was something in his movement quick, purposeful, almost urgent, that made her uneasy. She glanced at the cowboy, whose hand rested casually near the saddle, but never quite relaxed. She felt a mixture of reassurance and worry. He seemed ready for trouble, but the unknown always carried its own weight. "What brings him out here at this hour?" she murmured, more to herself than him. He didn't answer immediately, instead studying the horizon, calculating, observing. "People don't just wander the prairie for the view," he said finally. "Most have a reason. And if that reason's trouble? Well, we'll know soon enough." She swallowed, feeling a mixture of anticipation and fear. The unknown rider brought questions, complications, and the faint sense that their evening, fragile as it was, might not stay untouched. The cowboy's presence beside her, strong yet patient, reminded her that there was safety in numbers, or at least in understanding who you could trust. But he had already hinted at shadows in his own past, and she wondered whether they were heading toward a storm she wasn't yet prepared for. The distant man slowed, raising his head just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his face. There was something familiar in the sharpness of his eyes, a look that spoke of memory, of grudges held tight. And she realized with sudden clarity that the prairie had its own stories, ones that included men like this, ones that tested loyalty, courage, and resolve. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We may have company tonight," he said. "Nothing we can't handle, but it's better to be aware." He glanced at her with a look that carried more than warning, it carried a subtle invitation to trust him, to see in his calm the strength she might rely upon. Yet the tension between them, fragile and electric, was still unresolved, suspended on the edge of desire and caution. She nodded, trying to steady her breathing, feeling both the pull of curiosity and the instinct to protect herself. In a way, the approaching rider illuminated the complexity of her situation. The prairie wasn't just a backdrop for a quiet evening or a romantic question. It was alive with challenges, with choices that demanded courage, patience, and careful reading of people's intentions. The cowboy had entered her life like a quiet storm, and now that storm seemed intertwined with others, carrying a weight of conflict she hadn't anticipated. As the stranger drew nearer, she began to notice small details, the way his coat flapped in the wind, the faint leather scent mixed with smoke, the quick, restless movements of his hands. He looked like someone who had been riding hard, traveling with a purpose that wasn't friendly, someone who might bring trouble for reasons she couldn't yet guess. And she understood that the moment of potential romance with the cowboy was now layered with tension, a precarious balance between intimacy and survival. The cowboy shifted, almost imperceptibly, moving slightly closer to her, not touching, but creating a subtle barrier between her and the approaching stranger. It wasn't just protection. It was a signal that he was aware of danger, that he was ready to act, that he carried not just quiet strength but experience in handling what might come. She felt a strange comfort in that, even as the nervous energy in her chest twisted tighter. She wondered briefly about his past. The life that had shaped him into someone so patient yet ready, someone who could ask a gentle question in the midst of tension and carry it with sincerity. What had he endured? How had he learned to wait, to observe, to hold space without forcing outcomes? And she realized that part of the attraction, part of the suspense, came from the very unknowns she couldn't yet answer. The approaching rider slowed further, now close enough to make out a few details, but still distant enough that neither spoke. The cowboy's gaze sharpened, scanning, calculating. "He's looking for something," he said finally, almost to himself, but she caught the words. "Maybe a person. Maybe trouble." Her mind raced. The possibilities stretched across the prairie like the darkening horizon. Was the man a lost traveler, a pursuer, someone with a claim on the land or on the cowboy himself? The air felt thick with questions, with the tension of multiple threads about to intertwine. And she realized that whatever story the lone cowboy carried, it was now intersecting with something larger, something that might reveal layers of conflict she hadn't yet considered. The wind picked up again, tugging at her hair and carrying the faint scent of smoke closer. She knew instinctively that the night was far from ordinary, that the prairie had shifted from quiet backdrop to active participant in the unfolding story. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a possible warning. The cowboy remained calm, but she could sense the undercurrent of readiness in him, the subtle tension that only someone who had faced danger repeatedly could carry without breaking. "Should we speak to him?" she asked quietly, her voice tight with anticipation. He shook his head slightly, eyes still on the approaching rider. "Not yet. Let him come a little closer. Let's see what he wants." Sometimes the first move tells you more than words ever could. His hand hovered near the saddle again. Not a threat, but a signal that he was prepared. And she realized that the night, the prairie, and the people on it were all part of a larger rhythm that demanded patience, attention, and courage. The stranger was now close enough for the cowboy to nod slightly, almost imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement of recognition or assessment. She caught a glimpse of something in the man's eyes, challenge, curiosity, and understood that the conflict unfolding was about more than just bodies and words. It was about secrets, choices, and hidden histories, about trust earned or denied. And in the midst of it, the quiet tension between her and the cowboy remained, unresolved, electric, carrying the weight of something unspoken, yet profoundly compelling. She felt the night deepen further, the stars now bright overhead, the prairie alive with subtle noises and the faint scent of possibility. She realized that this was the moment when multiple threads of life converged, the cowboy's presence, the mysterious rider, her own cautious heart, and the endless expanse of the prairie that had seen countless stories unfold. And yet the question of whether she would allow herself to step closer to him, to answer the gentle request he had made, remained suspended, fragile, and full of promise. The cowboy did not speak again, only held his ground, eyes flicking from her to the approaching figure, measuring, waiting, calculating. And she understood that the conflict wasn't just outside. It was also inside her, a swirl of desire, caution, curiosity, and the recognition that the world was far more complicated than a single question, a single choice, or a single evening. The stranger finally slowed enough to halt at the edge of the fence, but neither man spoke immediately. The tension was palpable, stretching across the prairie, thickening the night air with unspoken threats and possibilities. She felt her heart pound in rhythm with the distant pulse of hooves and the silent calculations of the men before her. And though the prairie seemed vast, the space between them carried a weight that made it feel impossibly small. She realized then that this night, this encounter, would leave a mark on all of them. The tension, the unspoken questions, and the fragile pull between her and the lone cowboy were intertwined with the approaching threat. Every decision, every hesitation, and every glance mattered. And though the story was far from resolution, the stage had been set, the conflicts were rising, and the prairie held its breath for what would come next. The night had deepened into a heavy, velvety darkness, the stars faint against the horizon, their light struggling through a thin veil of clouds. The prairie, once soft and golden under the sun, now felt like a living entity, watching, listening, holding its breath. She stayed close to the fence, hands gripping the rough wood, knuckles whitening with tension. The lone cowboy remained beside her, silent, his posture calm but alert. Every movement he made was deliberate, measured, as if the night itself demanded respect, and he was fluent in its language. The stranger at the edge of the fence shifted, one hand resting near his coat, the other brushing a loose strap across his shoulder. She noticed the way the firelight from the distant cabin, faint though it was, glanced across his face, revealing sharp lines and eyes that were too aware, too careful to belong to someone who was innocent. There was something unfinished in his presence, a purpose that carried weight, and she felt a chill despite the warmth that had lingered from the day. "You know him?" she asked softly, her voice barely rising above the wind. The cowboy didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly as he measured the stranger's stance, the way his shoulders were set, the subtle cues of a man who had been riding long and hard. "Not exactly," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I know trouble when it rides in like that. And it's not the kind you want on your land, or near your heart." His words hung in the air, a quiet warning, more about instinct than explanation. She swallowed, feeling the weight of his words press against her chest. The prairie, the night, even the faintly glimmering stars seemed to underscore them, emphasizing the fragility of the moment. Desire and danger were tangled together in a way she hadn't anticipated. The gentle question he had asked earlier, "May I hold you now?" felt like it carried more risk than ever before, and she realized the stakes had shifted. The romantic tension was no longer separate from reality. It was entangled with caution, with the need to trust someone whose past and intentions she didn't fully understand. The stranger's hand twitched slightly, brushing against the edge of a holster that had been tucked under his coat. The movement was casual but deliberate, and she felt her pulse spike. The cowboy's eyes caught it instantly, and he stepped a fraction closer, his presence a shield that was both protective and commanding. She realized, with a mixture of fear and admiration, how much he had anticipated this, how much he understood the weight of unspoken threats. There was a subtle tension in the space between them, the kind that made every second stretch, every heartbeat amplified. "Evening," the stranger said finally, his voice rough but controlled. "Looks like I've found you." There was a pause, deliberate, measured. "Didn't expect company on the prairie tonight." His eyes flicked toward her. Then back to the cowboy, assessing, calculating. The cowboy's lips tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. His hand hovered near the saddle, the faint rustle of leather marking the readiness he carried, without raising alarm. There was an unspoken understanding in his gaze. One wrong move, and the fragile balance could shatter. She felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just about strangers meeting on the prairie. It was about choices, about trust, about the boundaries between courage and recklessness. Her mind raced, remembering stories her parents had told of nights on the prairie when tempers flared, when strangers brought danger, and when survival depended on reading every sound, every shadow, every subtle movement. And now she realized those stories were not just warnings, they were lessons, preparing her for nights like this, when the heart and instinct collided, when longing and fear intertwined. The stranger shifted again, taking a step closer, and she noticed the way his boots scuffed lightly against the soft prairie soil. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but it carried tension, a signal of movement with intent. She glanced at the cowboy, who remained calm but alert, eyes following the other man with quiet precision. There was a rhythm to the interaction, a slow dance of awareness and anticipation that left her breathless with suspense. "You don't belong here," the cowboy finally said, his voice low, carrying both authority and warning. "Not tonight." The stranger's lips curled slightly, but it was not a smile. "Maybe," he replied evenly, "maybe I do. Depends on what you consider belonging." There was a subtle edge to his tone, the kind that suggested past grievances and unspoken stakes. She felt a tug at the edges of her attention, realizing that this night was more than chance. It was a collision of histories, of intentions, of forces she couldn't yet untangle. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on her own hesitation, her own caution. She had been drawn to the cowboy, to the quiet strength he radiated, to the patience in his eyes. But now, with the stranger in their midst, the question of trust became urgent. Could she step forward, allow herself to lean into what she felt for him when danger hung so close? Or would caution prevail, forcing her back into solitude and uncertainty? The tension built, knotting her stomach and tightening her chest. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound from the distant cabin, a creak of timber, the low murmur of voices. She couldn't tell if it was connected to the stranger or if it was simply another element of the living prairie, but the effect was immediate. The night felt denser, the stakes higher. The prairie, for all its openness, seemed to compress around them, drawing focus to the three figures at the fence, to the silent questions and the tension held in suspended motion. She noticed then a subtle tremor in the stranger's posture, a twitch of the hand that might have been impatience or something else. Her instincts screamed caution while her heart whispered curiosity, a pull toward understanding the story behind those eyes, the story he carried across the prairie. And the cowboy beside her? He remained steady, a calm presence amid uncertainty, but she sensed the weight of unspoken truths in him as well. The night had grown thick with possibility, with suspense, with the inevitability of choices soon to be made. The stranger finally spoke again, voice low, carrying a warning that sent a shiver down her spine. "You think I'm alone out here, that I'm just passing through? You don't know what brought me, do you?" His eyes flicked sharply to the cowboy, and she saw recognition, calculation, tension. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a silent acknowledgement of stakes she could not yet grasp. The cowboy didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped ever so slightly closer to her, not enough to touch, but enough to make her feel the gravity of his presence. There was an invisible boundary being drawn, protective and commanding, yet patient and careful. And in that subtle movement she realized that his question from earlier, the gentle, "May I hold you?" was more than a romantic gesture. It was a test, a measure of trust, a choice hanging in the balance against the backdrop of imminent conflict. Her chest tightened as adrenaline mingled with desire. She could feel the tension in the air, dense and electric, stretching across the space between the three figures. The prairie itself seemed to lean in, watching, as if it had seen countless nights like this unfold and was aware that tonight's choices would leave marks far deeper than footprints in the soil. Every shadow, every subtle sound, every shift in posture carried meaning, and she felt herself straining to understand, to anticipate, to read the invisible cues that might determine safety or chaos. The stranger's gaze lingered on her for a heartbeat longer than necessary, assessing, weighing, testing. She swallowed, feeling both fear and fascination. She realized that the night was no longer about romance alone. It was about courage, about discernment, about understanding the forces converging around her. The tension between the cowboy and the stranger was mirrored in the tension within her own heart, the pull of attraction countered by the instinct to protect, to wait, to observe. The cowboy finally spoke again, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the quiet night. "You've had your chance to ride in here and test the prairie. Don't push it further." There was no anger, no threat beyond the weight of certainty. It was authority, patience, and an unspoken promise rolled into one measured tone. The stranger hesitated, a subtle tightening of the shoulders, and for a moment the night hung still, frozen between breaths, between choices, between the pull of desire and the tension of danger. The stars overhead blinked faintly as if waiting along with her, as if the prairie itself had paused to mark the moment before the storm. She felt her own pulse echo in her ears, a wild rhythm, a reminder that everything was hanging on the edge. The question he had asked earlier, gentle and intimate, still lingered in her mind. But now it carried layers she hadn't anticipated. Trust, courage, judgment, patience, and the understanding that love, connection, and danger could coexist, each demanding attention. The stranger shifted again, the faint scrape of boot against dirt loud in the silence. The cowboy's hand brushed slightly against the saddle, ready, but not aggressive. And she realized then that the night was moving toward a breaking point, that choices would soon have to be made, and that the next moments could determine the course of more than one life. The tension was unbearable, the prairie holding every heartbeat, every whisper, every flicker of thought. And though the resolution had not come, the stage was set, the conflicts were peaking, and the anticipation hung in the air, thick, electric, impossible to ignore. The night held its breath for just a moment longer before the tension broke, like a string finally loosened after holding too tight. The stranger blinked, his posture shifting from confrontation to hesitation. For the first time, he seemed unsure, exposed under the open prairie sky, and the cowboy noticed immediately. There was no need for words. He had already read the story in the man's stance, the way his eyes darted, the faint tremor in his jaw. "You've come a long way for nothing," the cowboy said quietly, voice steady, patient, carrying no anger, only calm authority. "You're searching for trouble that isn't here." The stranger's gaze flicked between the two of them. Something unspoken passed in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a silent admission that he had miscalculated. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he tipped his hat and stepped back. Maybe you're right," he said finally. His voice was rough but softer than before, carrying a hint of respect. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off into the shadows, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the distance. She exhaled a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension in her chest eased slightly, replaced with a warm pulse of relief. The prairies seemed to exhale with her, the wind softening, carrying the faint scent of wild sage and dry earth. The night, once heavy with uncertainty, now felt alive with possibility, and she realized how close she had been to a storm she hadn't fully understood until now. The cowboy shifted slightly, still standing near her, and she noticed the faint softening of his features. His eyes, dark and steady all night, now held a subtle warmth that reached her in a way words couldn't. The question he had asked hours earlier, "May I hold you?" still lingered. But now it was no longer overshadowed by fear or danger. It carried the promise of connection, of trust finally allowed, of hearts meeting after all the waiting and caution. You handled that well," she said softly, almost as a question, her fingers still gripping the fence but loosening slightly. Her voice held a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I didn't know how it would end." He gave a small nod, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sometimes it's not about the ending," he said, voice low, careful. "It's about seeing it through, staying steady, choosing what matters when it matters most." His gaze met hers fully now, no shadows, no hesitation, only sincerity. The prairie was quiet again, but it felt different, this time safer, richer, alive with the subtle promise of dawn. She realized how much the night had changed her, how much the tension, the near danger, and the patient presence of the cowboy had opened a space inside her that she hadn't known was ready. She could feel the shift in herself, the soft unwrapping of walls she had kept carefully in place for years. I think I understand," she said finally, letting her hands drop from the fence, letting herself breathe. The relief and anticipation mingled in her chest, warm and grounding. "Not just about tonight, but about everything." The cowboy's smile grew just slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of her words and her courage. He stepped closer now, enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him without fear, enough that the tension between them shifted from suspenseful to intimate, gentle, and comforting. "Then maybe it's time for the next step," he said softly, his voice carrying that same steady patience that had guided them through the night. She looked up at him, seeing him fully for the first time, not just the silhouette in the shadows or the figure shaped by danger, but the man behind the quiet strength. And in that moment something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the night had been a test of patience, courage, and heart. She nodded slowly, her pulse racing not from fear but from trust and desire, a willingness to let go and lean into the connection that had grown quietly all evening. He extended his hand gently, not with urgency, not with demand, but with invitation. She took it, feeling the rough warmth of his fingers wrap around hers. It was grounding, comforting, and entirely honest. The simple gesture carried more weight than anything else had that night, the promise of companionship, of understanding, and of shared courage. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft wind and the distant rustle of prairie grass. "So am I," he replied, and the sincerity in his tone made her heart swell. He moved just slightly closer, careful, steady, and she felt herself responding instinctively. The tension that had dominated the night now melting into something gentle, something real. For the first time she realized that the prairie, the danger, the long hours of uncertainty, they had all been a prelude to this. A moment of clarity and connection she hadn't expected but was ready to embrace. The wind carried the distant cry of an owl, and the faint flicker of stars seemed to shine brighter, as if witnessing the unspoken promise between them. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs, grounding herself in the moment. The cowboy's hand remained in hers, steady and patient, a tether of warmth and trust. And for the first time that night she allowed herself to imagine a future where fear no longer dictated her choices, where connection was not just possible but inevitable. "You've changed the way I see this prairie," she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I thought it was just land, just wide open space, but it's more than that. It holds people, stories, choices, and now it holds this moment too." He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "It's always been more than it seems," he said, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "The land teaches you about patience, about trust, about holding on and letting go, and sometimes it gives you exactly what you need if you're willing to wait for it." She laughed softly, a sound mingled with relief and joy. "I think I've been waiting too long," she admitted, "and maybe so have you." He gave a small, approving nod, and the quiet comfort of understanding settled between them like a warm blanket. The night had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and in the process, it had revealed what mattered most: honesty, patience, courage, and a willingness to trust. She realized that the tension and danger had not been obstacles. They had been part of the journey, sharpening awareness, building resilience, and ultimately allowing them to arrive at this moment fully aware, fully present, and fully ready. The distant stars twinkled faintly above, the prairie stretching endlessly around them, but she no longer felt small or isolated. She felt connected to the land, to the night, and to the man who had stood steadfast beside her. The cowboy's presence was no longer just a symbol of mystery or danger. It was a promise, a grounding anchor, and a gentle reminder that love and trust often arrived quietly, even after long nights of uncertainty. They stayed by the fence for a while longer, neither rushing nor speaking unnecessarily, letting the quiet wrap around them. The events of the night, the approach of the stranger, the tension, the unspoken fears had passed, leaving clarity and the comforting weight of understanding. She felt a sense of peace, a rare kind that comes not from certainty, but from choosing to stand beside someone who offers steady presence in a world that often feels unpredictable. Finally, she looked up at him fully, meeting his gaze with trust and quiet anticipation. He smiled gently, and in that smile she recognized everything that had carried them through the night: patience, courage, honesty, and the willingness to let something fragile grow. And in response, she allowed herself to step slightly closer, the physical distance melting as their hands remained intertwined, as their presence acknowledged the promise of something lasting, something real. The prairie, wide and endless, seemed to stretch with them, holding space for their connection, reflecting back the light of the first faint glow of dawn. The wind softened, carrying the scent of earth and wild sage, and she realized that the world had not ended with the night's tension, it had begun anew, offering possibility, promise, and a gentle, steady hope. The cowboy's hand brushed gently against hers, not in urgency, not in demand, but in reassurance, and she felt the weight of the night lift completely. She could finally breathe, fully present, fully aware of the depth of connection, the thrill of trust, and the quiet, undeniable intimacy that had grown between them. "I think we've both been waiting for this," she whispered. "And now we don't have to wait anymore," he replied softly. The sun began to rise faintly over the prairie, golden light spilling across the grass, illuminating the world and marking a new day. The night's conflicts, the tension, the uncertainties, they were behind them, leaving only understanding, courage, and a shared presence that promised a future together. She realized that every moment, every challenge, every heartbeat of suspense had led them to this, a gentle, honest connection born out of patience, bravery, and trust. As they stood together, hand in hand, watching the prairie awaken, she understood what had been true all along, that love, trust, and courage were never separate. They were entwined, and when nurtured patiently, they could transform even the loneliest of hearts. The cowboy's gentle question had not been just a moment, it had been the start of everything, the spark that carried them through danger, doubt, and into the warmth of understanding. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, full of promise, full of light, and she knew that whatever storms might come in the future, they would face them together. And in that quiet, unassuming way, she realized that sometimes the simplest questions hold the deepest power, and the gentlest gestures can change a life forever. The lone cowboy, steady and patient, looked at her with warmth and quiet certainty, and she smiled back, heartful, knowing that the night's trials had led them to exactly where they were meant to be. The prairie, the wind, the stars all had witnessed the story, and now it rested in peace, wrapped in trust, courage, and the gentle promise of love.